Well, hello everyone. Greetings from Alora. Thank you for the opportunity to have to provide some perspective on where consumers are at relative to dairy products specifically and food products generally as we uh, come out of COVID. And my title says coming out of COVID. Some might argue that that's a little bit optimistic given the current situation, but I think regardless of when things get back to a new normal, many of the things that I talk about will be relevant regardless of the timeline. Before I go sort of looking forward, let's take a minute to look back and say, how did we do as COVID hit? And much of this will be familiar to you, but I think it bears repeating just to be clear on where we're at right now. I think the first thing to highlight is that the food system was incredibly resilient. It really worked very well. We saw it bend, but not break. And I think that there were that while things, especially in March and early April, there was a lot in the news. Uh, Looking back in sober second thought, things went really profoundly well. We saw an unprecedented demand shock, the closure of food service, the surge in demand at retail, which led to some empty shelves in the short run. But the disruptions to a significant degree were short term. We saw, vegetables plowed back down in the field because we couldn't get them to the restaurants that had demanded them. We saw milk get dumped, but really only for a few days. And that's just a reflection of kind of our just in time and market specific value chains. In the case of the vegetables, those products were grown specifically for a restaurant customer because they're highly perishable. Redirecting them, developing those supply chain relationships that we could have sold them to those other markets took some time, and so in the short term we had some products spoil. The exact same thing happened with milk. The disruption in demand for specific products meant that some products weren't demanded as much. We had to transition over. We had to transition processing over. We had to transition packaging over, and in order to do that, we had to sort of redirect things in the value chain, and that meant that in the short term, because we don't have a lot of excess storage in the system, we had to dump milk. That fortunately was very short term. That happens for a couple of reasons. Much of the distribution system is focused on one system or the other, on food service or on retail, and so shifting products over takes some time. It also we also eat different foods in different markets. We eat far fewer French fries at home than we do in restaurants. We eat more cheese in restaurants than we do at home. We drink more milk at home than we do in restaurants. So there's those changes that we had to adapt to. It isn't just moving it into another value stream. It's often changing the form that product is in, and also the packaging that product's in. Milk goes to Tim Hortons in either little creamer cups or in large bags that they put in their dispensers, and neither of those get sold in retail. So it was adjusting the system, getting the right inventories of packaging and those sorts of things, but it happened quickly and it went really well. Um, some things that are worth taking a quick look at. Here is some data for sort of March, early April, when the advisory against non-essential travel and sort of we were told to stay home. All of a sudden there was this huge spike of almost 50% year over year in demand. That came back in the subsequent weeks when people began to say, yeah, we're comfortable that the stores are going to stay open. Things have changed, but we're going to have access to food. And that sort of 15 to 20% number is what I would expect most stores to be at. It could get up to 25. I've heard some stores that were doing a really good job had much bigger increases in demand. So I think it depended on where you were, but we had that huge spike. After that huge spike, for some things there was panic buying, rice, pasta, clearly demand much higher than just the fact that we were transferring, about a third of our food dollar that we spent previously on restaurants, we weren't spending anymore, so we had to buy more in retail. But clearly here there's some stockpiling going on. That stockpiling happened in the short term. You know, excuse me, we heard people talking about toilet paper and panic buying toilet paper, but there was also all sorts of shelf stable goods that people for a couple of weeks panic bought. We've seen much less of that in this sort of emergence of the second wave, which articulates to a degree, in my view, that people are more confident about the food system, and I'll show you some evidence of that shortly. The last thing I wanted to do was to say, yes, we had panic buying, we had that shift from food service to retail, but we also had some fundamental changes in behavior. I'm one of those sort of strange people who started baking bread and other things during the pandemic as a way to get away from this desk that I sit at and do most of my day-to-day work. And so we saw huge increases in flour for the dairy industry. That also means milk, butter. Demand is up. That's a fundamental change in behavior. So it's important, I think, to distinguish the fact that some of the peak was panic buying as people were stocking up on things that they thought they might not be able to get. That's going to go away. Some of that demand change was simply moving demand from food service to retail. Some of that will be around longer as we see sort of changes happening in food service. And some of it is a fundamental change in behavior, which may or may not, we haven't bought in our house, for example, bread from a grocery store since the middle of April. My enthusiasm may wane over time and I might start buying some bread again, but fundamentally, we are probably in the long term going to eat more butter and other baking needs in our house going forward. So three changes in how people shopped with varying degrees of sustainability. How sustainable those changes in demand will be remains to be seen. So what are consumers thinking? I mean, there's some work out of the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity that says 87% of Canadians feel good about the ability of the food system to deliver. So confidence in the food system is high. There was some uncertainty that caused the panic buying. People weren't sure about what was going to happen, were the borders going to close, were processors going to close. Overall, I think this is evidence that people saw the system respond well. And I think we're seeing less panic buying this time around. There was not any more panic buying when some of our food processing plants, notably the Cargill plant in High River, closed. So people saw and heard about some bumps in the road, but there wasn't sort of a fundamental sort of lack of confidence built in the food system. People are comfortable. That's a record high. People said, look, we were uncertain. There's lots to be uncertain about in the current environment, but the system responded really, really well, and we continue to hear it responding well. And I think that's a really good thing. It says good things not only about the Canadian system, but about the food system broadly. And that confidence, I think, is not only warranted, but is really good for the system. So what's changed? Which of these things would I say are fundamental changes in people's behavior? And the next slide will say, maybe talk a little bit more about what hasn't changed. So I think there are more online purchases. We've seen these organizations really work hard at delivering. Retailers work hard at delivering the online experience for those that wanted it. We saw companies scrambling to deliver more. Sobeys introduced their Voila delivery in many urban centers, particularly around the GTA. We're seeing Walmart and Loblaws really scramble to come up with ways for shoppers to to shop online. That had been relatively low prior to COVID. We've probably seen that trend accelerate. I expect that there might be some falling off as people are allowed to go back in or feel comfortable about going back into retail, but we'll never go back to those levels as before. That means people buy differently. In an online environment, people tend to buy what they've bought before, and it's much harder to get them to buy something different or something new. People who sell chips and pop, where it's often an impulse buy, will perhaps have to struggle and to innovate and find ways to get people to consider those products in that changed environment. Retailers love it. Online customers are more loyal, twice as loyal, and their baskets are bigger. Doesn't mean they're buying more necessarily overall, but if their baskets are bigger, then it lowers the risk that they're buying it from someone else. On the flip side, I would say there are also more opportunities for direct to consumer. Other than my mother, who was cheap and retired and liked to go to different stores to take advantage of different specials, most of us don't have the time to do that. But if we're shopping online, switching between websites is much easier than switching between stores. So I think you'll see some increase in specialty products that will sell direct to consumer. We're shipping. We've seen fundamentally a change in behavior for the wine industry, the microbreweries. I think we'll see a lot of that in the food industry as well. I've spoken to a micro miller of flour whose demand has gone up 3,000% because people are buying direct from her. So that will be a real change that will endure beyond COVID. Restaurant disruption is medium term. We'll probably see a lot of restaurants close, unfortunately. There'll be different in-restaurant experience in that there'll be fewer people in the restaurant. At least in the short term, we'll have all sorts of infection control measures. So even if we're going out, our experience is going to be different. It'll be more expensive. So I expect that while we will eventually get back to a significant share of the food dollar being on food bought outside the home, that won't happen in the immediate future. There'll also be more specialization. I think we'll see what we call ghost kitchens, where we'll have groups of kitchens that are only in the delivery business, and there'll be a Mexican and a Chinese and an Italian and a sushi place all in close proximity that will efficiently leverage the delivery experience. So that has implications for the relative demand of different food products, including the relative demand of specific dairy products. And then the last question is, will the demand changes stick? Will people like me continue to buy lots of flour and extra butter because we're baking at home and other activities? I expect that some of those habits will stick, but that we will see sort of a correction back to sort of a level somewhere between where it was before and where it is now. So now I'm back to where I wanted to be. I apologize for that break. So what hasn't changed? Well, I think while we have seen some decrease in choice as the system recovered, as we responded to this big change in demand, we saw some SKUs on grocery store shelves disappear as processors scrambled to meet the demand for those core products. And so there was some suggestion early in the pandemic that this would sustain, that these unprofitable or lower volume choices would disappear. I believe that that's not true. I think if anything, we're going to continue to see an expansion of choice. And it's not because you or I want more different choices. It's because you or I want different things. And so retailers have to balance how much of that they offer if they want to bring as many of us as possible into the store. So more diversity and choice, I think, will continue to happen. Some of those functional offers, desire for healthy choices. There will continue to be more diversity in proteins, which doesn't mean the end of animal proteins by any stretch. It just means there'll be more people eating different things. We'll talk about cellular dairy at some point playing a role. It's not going to take over the market by any stretch, but it will provide a niche. Plant-based alternatives will continue to grow and diversify. And frankly, people will also just eat less protein, so or intake less protein. So there'll be more and more variety in these grocery stores, and for some of us that will be overwhelming choice, and it'll be interesting to see how that changes over time. I think the value of local will continue to be important. We're talking about the predictability, the love of local, and the Blue Cow, I think, is a perfect example of that. And it's also important to remember that affordability matters, and to a significant degree, while all of these other things matter, and we are seeing people pay a premium, we still have to be in that sweet spot for consumers to buy our goods. So that very quickly are some of the key points I wanted to cover today. I wanted to say thanks. If you were looking forward to the panel discussion, if you have questions for me afterwards, that's my email address, some shameless self-promotion. Feel free to contact me if you have questions or suggestions or anything. That's my Twitter handle, and I'm happy. I tweet about food-related issues all the time. And I have a blog and podcast where we talk about issues related to food, including dairy. You can find it at foodfocusguelph.ca. If you're interested in some more information. So that's what I wanted to cover. Thank you for your attention, and looking